Hi everyone, welcome to my latest video. Thank you for tuning in. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different on this channel. I'm going to be sketching for the first time entirely not on location. I'm calling this my studio sessions, and I'm drawing from a photograph, and there'll be larger pieces. And it's something that I think I'll be doing, especially in the winter months where it's harder to get outside and sketch on location like I started this channel doing. In part, I want to improve my watercolor techniques and my drawing abilities, and I find working at home, it's a lot easier to focus on these techniques and to practice. And so I'm actually revisiting a drawing that I just shared, which was of a boat engine. And I really love this engine, and I felt that the sketch I'd done before really didn't capture the engine very well. And so I wanted to do this on a bigger piece. And I thought this was a great opportunity to try out these studio sessions. So I'm sharing up ahead that sketch that I'm talking about that I did on location. In a sketchbook, and I just found it was a bit muddy. The proportions weren't quite right, and it didn't really resemble the engine in the end. So when I'm drawing from a photo, it's a very different process. I sort of grid out my page after determining the composition, and the composition is something that I do in Photoshop. It's with the photograph, and I crop it the way that I'd like it to be on the page, and then I make a grid in Photoshop and then grid the page with the same measurements of grids so that I can really accurately draw what I then want to paint. I find it's a different muscle. It's less intuitive, and it's more, well, actually it's more intuitive in some ways in that I find it's just copying shapes, and I'm less concerned about the overall structure of the drawing and more matching exactly the shapes that I see in the grids. I find it's a faster and easier way to get the drawing down, and it's not quite tracing. Anyway, it's new to me, so that's how I've developed this pencil work. And I did try to get just the basics in pencil, and then I'm adding the detail in pen. And so that's the pencil and pen process. And now I'm starting to work on the initial washes. And so I decided to wet all around the engine, sort of the below deck portions and then the rear of the transom that are in shadow. And so I'm just wetting only those areas to prevent paint from bleeding into the engine where I don't want it. And so I'm doing this partly to just help pop the engine out and as a way to start working through the piece. Another benefit of filming this from home is that I can set up and have a better control over my camera setup, and so you can see my palette as well as the page. Unfortunately, I don't have the same natural light coming into the space, so I am using fluorescent light, and it's not as nice, and there's a harsher shadow than when I had the natural light coming into the space, but overall, still good. You can see I just threw some paint on the page just to break the tension of a completely blank canvas. And so you can see adding wet on wet, the pigment's really lively. And I've taped the page to a substrate. In this case, it's just foam core, which seemed to hold up okay. I was a bit surprised to the moisture of the paper, but it allows me to rotate the page. I do have the whole thing set at an angle as I'm working so that the watercolor flows and it's not just on a flat plane. So that was the background wash, and now I'm going to do the interior now that that outer bounds is dried, and I've wet the entire engine block, and I'm going in with an orange. And you'll see from the reference photos and even the initial sketch I did, it was a very rich red, and I'm using a bit of creative license. I like orange and wanted to start with an orange base and layer in reds to get a more, I don't know if dramatic's the right word, or dynamic coloration throughout the engine. I also just like orange. And you can see I've left the various intake lines as white so that they're not colored orange, and I can have a more even coloration when I do them in the darker grays. And so this is my favorite part of watercolor, and a part that I'm still learning. I'm using wet on wet and having the paints mix on the page. I find it gives very nice soft edges. And you'll see in this piece, I think I sort of overdo it and I start adding more and more wet on wet to the point where I think I'm taking pigment off the page. You'll see what I mean a little bit later on. So I'm mixing a bit of a richer, more reddy orange into that initial base coat of orange and trying to leave some highlight spots. And here I've mixed up a cherry red almost, and I've pushed in some deep reds into the engine, into the areas that are most in shadow. And then I skipped ahead a little bit, but I've tried to mix up some blue as a contrast, especially in the deep shadow areas, to push into the wet pigment. And this is, I think, where I go a step too far. I think it's overworked, and in future I might let this initial orange wash dry fully and then go in with a completely different wash when everything is dry. But that was the very involved initial wash. Yeah, you can see I just moved some pigment off the page there. And now I'm going with the grays, and I'm going to pull out the tubes that I left as white space. And I did that to really allow the volume of the tubes to read. They're not flat, and they're black material, but they're actually quite bright in relation to some of the other areas of the engine. So I wanted to leave that white space to allow that lighter tone to show through. And then I tried to push in at the tube edges and at the bottom edge of that tube that I'm working on to push in more pigment on the shadowy edges. And as I'm watching myself do this, I'm reflecting a little bit on how I ended up just doing a full watercolor painting. It's not something I ever anticipated getting into. I'd like to do these outdoor sketches, and I wanted to add a little bit more volume and life to them, and got into watercolor that way. And now that the weather's changed, I still want to get my fix of watercoloring, and here I am just doing a watercolor painting from a photo. And it's a great way to get more practice to understand how to work with watercolors. So I'm going to be sharing more of these. I've actually been doing a number of portrait sketches sometimes in the evenings. There's a Reddit channel that I follow where people post pictures of themselves asking to be drawn, and I use it for practice, and I really enjoy it. So I might be sharing some of that as well. Just ways to slowly pick away at improving my watercolor for when I get to go out and do the on-location stuff. So now at this point, the first 2 washes are done. I've let the page dry, and now I'm actually re-wetting some of the shadow areas. And the idea is I'm going in to do the deepest shadows now. So I've mixed my blue and brown together. Unfortunately, I lean in to get close, so it was hard to find footage. But you can see the deepest shadows under the engine there. I've pushed in on wet paper. And same for the engine block itself. Really tried to pull some of the lighter elements to the foreground and push some of the interior volumes back with the deeper tone. And in some ways I really like this painting. I think there's parts that really pop. There's obviously lots of areas that I'd like to improve upon. But I understand this is going to be a very long process, and I'm enjoying it, so it makes it easy to keep going. And let me know in the comments if you're watching, if you're enjoying this type of video, if you have a similar experience, if maybe you're on your own watercolor journey, some of the things you find encouraging, please share. And then I tried to give the floor of the boat a different texture. There's a rubber mat that's made of these little tubes, and I'm trying to just notionally suggest there's a different texture to the floor of the boat, and didn't want to put as much detail into it. I really wanted this to be about the engine, and everything else, sort of fades into the background. I wasn't planning to provide commentary through this entire video, but we're getting near the end, and I feel like I haven't stopped talking. But we're getting down to the fine details now. So I have a synthetic brush that's for doing exactly this, fine lines, and just putting that red pinstriping at the top of the engine in, and then writing in abstract shapes the Volvo Penta. And thanks so much for tuning in. If you've enjoyed, please give a like and subscribe. Thank you.